I am very, very excited to welcome you all here. The idea for this workshop was born about a year ago when Adam Frank and Evan Thompson were both fellows at the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement here at Dartmouth. And we were talking about these ideas and decided that we are going to write an essay. And we also decided it would be wonderful to get together with colleagues from different areas that have similar interests in these questions to kind of discuss, some of our ideas about the notion of experience and the notion of our search for truth. And so here we are. It worked, and we actually managed to get you the best weather we've had since October, which is kind of unfortunate to be spending it in here, but still, I hope you enjoy the morning, those of you that are not from here. So if you do not know me, my name is Marcelo Gleiser. I'm a professor of physics and astronomy here at Dartmouth, and I direct this Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement, which has generous funding from the Templeton Foundation. And so what we're going to do is, in the course of the next 2 days, we're going to talk about the notion of experience from different points of view. There'll be people talking more from a physicist perspective, from a Buddhist perspective, from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, and I think we're all going to learn a lot from one another, which is really what I am here for. So I'm very excited about this idea. Now, also, happy Earth Day, everyone, because it is Earth Day after all. And it's also the Discovery of Brazil Day today, the 22nd of April, when the Portuguese arrived in Brazil to destroy the country. It was quite amazing what they did down there. Anyway, so we kind of celebrate that in a very strange way in Brazil. So let me just say by reminding people of Protagoras. So Protagoras was a pre-Socratic philosopher from about 450 BCE. And he is famous or infamous for having said something like, man is the measure of all things. And, the problem with the pre-Socratics is that we don't have the real books they wrote. We only have fragments of what they said and commentary that was usually written 100 to 200 years after they died with a lot of bias towards what they said. So we don't quite know exactly the context in which he said that, but he has been named by many people, including Plato in his dialogue Protagoras, as the father of relativism, and because he would say that you can't agree on anything if it's 20 degrees Celsius and somebody is cold and somebody is hot, that's their choice. We can't really decide for them, even though the temperature may be the same. But I would like to invert what Protagoras says and say instead that man may or not be the measure of all things, but there is one thing that man and humanity is that we are the things that can measure. And the fact that we can measure means that we connect with nature in ways that depend very much on, first of all, what we perceive of nature with our senses, right, which is really the first immediate measurement of what we would call the outside reality, right? But then we expand that, or we amplify that reality with all the tools and instruments that we have used across thousands of years to get better measurements of the skies, of the land, and of course now of subatomic particles and very far away colliding black holes and things like that. So a lot of what we do as we ponder what is the world and our place in it and what is reality made of is really dependent on how we interact with reality through our instruments and how we sense what's going on through the instruments. And so the instruments are, in a sense, a bridge between what we perceive of the world out there, unless you're doing an fMRI, which is another conversation, and us here having the experience of that world. So everything that we do, in a sense, is bridged towards this connection between the experience and the outside reality. And for that reason, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One of them is that our instruments, even though they are wonderful, and you could actually write a whole history of science, based on the evolution of instrumentation and how they changed worldviews, right? I mean, for people that are not in the sciences in the audience, I have to remind our speakers that this is supposed to be an open dialogue, in the sense that we will be people from, not from necessarily from academia here. So a very typical example of that is, that I like to use, is Galileo and his telescope. So there was a very specific worldview that was very Aristotelian by the time Galileo pointed the telescope that he reproduced to the skies. And because of that, he came up with information about the skies that nobody else had before. And that, of course, prompted his way of writing about it in his Sidereus Nuncis, and then in his other books, which made us revisit, what the universe really is like, much more than Copernicus had done, right? I mean, because poor Copernicus, he wrote his book in 1543, and Owen Gingerich, this historian of science, said that, he has a book about Copernicus, book that says, this is the book nobody read. And very few people actually read and was influenced by Copernicus. And the guys who were the true Copernicans, were really Galileo and Kepler. And a lot of what has been done, both from Galileo's telescope and Kepler, was, Tycho Brahe's measurements. So the role of measurement, and the fact that measurement really is a way in which we codify and quantify physical reality to amplify our perception of the world, I think plays a very important role in how we experience this world. So the discussion in the next couple of days, and this is just, I'm just trying to present a little bit of context here, is really about this. Can we take ourselves out of the picture, so to speak, and create a narrative of the world that is independent on how we experience it, right? And the point that Adam and Evan and myself, we made on that essay that we wrote for Aeon was that you just cannot. And because of that, there are all sorts of complications that come up when we deal with issues in which you really can't extricate, the observer or the person or the experience from what is being observed, right? And we'll talk a lot about this in the next couple of days, and I'm very excited to hear from all of you. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So remember that the talks are slated for about 40 minutes each, and it would be nice if you could do it in 35, so we have at least 5 minutes for Q&A. Also, the other thing that we did is we have a big break tomorrow between noon and 3 p.m. And I have reserved a room in the physics department where people can hang out and talk if they want to, because, or they can also walk around, whatever is, but if you need a blackboard and a coffee machine, it will be there for you. Okay, very good. I am going to introduce our first speaker. So Evan Thompson, right here, is a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His research and teaching focus on cognitive science, the philosophy of mind, and cross-cultural philosophy, especially Asian philosophy in dialogue with Eastern philosophy and science. He's the author of Waking Dreaming Beings, Self and Consciousness in Neuroscience, Meditation, and in Philosophy, that was published by Columbia University Press in 2015, and many other volumes, including The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience, which is an incredibly important book in co-authorship with Francisco Varela. And he has a new book that is going to come out when? January 2020, which is going to incite a lot of interesting conversation called Why I'm Not a Buddhist. Coming from a real expert in Buddhism, that will be quite fabulous. Okay, Edmund, please.
Is this good here for the mic position? It's good? Yeah, okay. Well, thanks to Marcelo for putting this event together. Should be lots of fun. The title of our workshop is The Blind Spot, and the idea came from an article that Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser and I wrote for ION about science and human experience. And Michel Bitbol also uses the analogy of the blind spot in his work. We argue that science has a blind spot. There's something that lies at the heart of science that makes science possible, but that science doesn't see, or typically doesn't see. This is lived experience, everything that life is to us experientially. Science presupposes direct experience, but overlooks its primacy in knowledge. So to kick off the workshop, I would like to present this idea and a few of my thoughts about it. And I don't expect agreement at all. I'm hoping to provoke discussion. Okay, so let's start with the visual blind spot. There's a blind spot in each eye, each vertebrate eye. You can find your own blind spot with the demonstration that you should have that I handed out. The blind spot corresponds to the part of the eye where the optic nerve leaves the retina and there are no photoreceptors. We're usually not aware of the blind spot, but notice what happens when you find your blind spot. The dot on the page disappears, but you don't see a hole. You see a uniform expanse, the white surface of the paper. The area of the dot now appears to have the same brightness and color as what's outside it. Vision scientists call this phenomenon filling in or perceptual completion. We fill in or complete the blind spot with the color and brightness that surrounds it. So we don't see our blind spot. We don't know anything is missing. We just fill it in with more of the same. We don't see that we don't see. Now, it's this idea that we don't see that we don't see that carries over to scientific knowledge and direct experience. The contention, this was the contention in our article for ION, is that we lose sight of direct experience when we're doing science because we treat everything as though it were an object. But lived experience is precisely not an object. It's that by which objects are there for us. For this reason, experience can't be exhaustively objectified. When we treat it as an object, we don't see it as the condition of objects being present to us, and we don't see that we don't see. We can make this more concrete by thinking about our bodies. For science, the body is an object. Anatomy, physiology, biomedicine, these sciences treat the body as an objective thing in the world. Cognitive science looks at the body as a functional system. But the body of our lived experience, the lived body, is never just an object. It's first and foremost a subject. We come upon our bodies as objects only because they show up for us from our perspective as bodily subjects. Another way to think about it is that the body never fully appears in our egocentric space, the individual's egocentric space, because it's that by which we have an egocentric space. By analogy, lived experience never fully appears in any scientific representation because it's that by which we have scientific representations and that by which they're meaningful. Science is a powerful method for knowing objects. Indeed, it's the best method for this kind of knowledge. But it leaves something out, namely the direct experience of the knower. Now, by itself, this doesn't have to be a problem. Science is a method, and any method is a limited instrument. The problem comes when we forget this about science and set it up as the best or only legitimate form of knowledge, the one that reveals things as they are in themselves. This way of thinking conflates a method of investigation with being. The scientific method discloses the world in a certain way as an object, but objectivity is a way of understanding. It's one way of thinking about things rather than the one way things are. The problem is that we constantly forget this. This forgetful tendency is especially prevalent in the science of consciousness, an area in which I do a lot of work in collaboration with neuroscientists. This year, a commentary was published in Nature Human Behavior called Opportunities and Challenges for a Maturing Science of Consciousness. Many prominent scientists and philosophers signed it. It began with the section heading From Mystery to Maturing Science. The alliteration is good, but the thought is not. Our science of consciousness may be maturing, but not because it's left the mystery of consciousness behind. There's no question that impressive scientific progress is being made on consciousness. We're getting a better understanding of the brain as a complex system. We're learning more about how dynamical neural networks support perception, attention, memory, metacognition, and spontaneous thought, all of the mental processes that make up our conscious awareness. As the Nature commentary points out, quote, the widespread adoption of rigorous experimental procedures using subjective reports, once eschewed by behaviorists as being outside the realm of science, has paved the way for new areas of inquiry within neuroscience, end quote. Consciousness science is also making new contributions to clinical research on pain, the neurological disorders of vegetative and minimally conscious states, psychiatric disorders such as anxiety, and mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. I'm as enthusiastic about all these advances as anyone. Nevertheless, the fundamental problem of what consciousness is and how sentience arises in nature, the so-called mystery, remains present as ever before. The Nature commentary ends with a call, quote, to develop the science of subjective experience, end quote. But it doesn't confront the problem of how to understand subjective experience as such. Instead, it surreptitiously slides the subjective into the domain of the objective. This is the blind spot. Let me zoom out now to say a few things about the philosophical framework that goes along with the blind spot. And one interesting discussion we could have is how much actually the blind spot really has to do with not science as such, but with a way of thinking about science that's very, very widespread. So I'm going to call that way of thinking physicalistic objectivism. Physicalism is the thesis that everything is physical. Or if we rule out abstract objects like numbers and propositions, then physicalism says that everything spatio-temporal and concrete is physical. This is a metaphysical thesis. Objectivism is the thesis that the methods science uses to understand the world can be used to understand everything. This is an epistemological thesis. Putting them together, we get what's popularly called scientific materialism. Physicalistic objectivism faces two intractable problems. The first one concerns physicalism. When we try to say exactly what physicalism means, it turns out to be either false or empty. On the one hand, if physical reality means reality as physics today describes it, then physicalism is false because physics today will be superseded. Furthermore, physical science today, including biology and computational neuroscience, doesn't include an account of consciousness or sentience. This isn't to say that consciousness is something unnatural or supernatural. The point is that physical science today doesn't include an account of experience, but we know that experience exists, so the claim that the only things that exist are what physical science today tells us exists is false. On the other hand, if physical reality means reality according to some future and complete physics, then the claim that there is nothing else but physical reality is empty, because we have no idea what such a future physics will look like, especially in relation to consciousness. Now, this problem for physicalism, that it's either false or empty, is known as Hempel's dilemma, named after the philosopher of science Carl Gustav Hempel. The formulation I gave is a little bit different from his, but it amounts to basically the same thing. Some philosophers try to get out of the dilemma by saying that we need to define the concept of the physical in advance. They argue that no matter how far the bounds of the physical stretch, it's a conceptual truth that the physical can't include irreducible mentality. So we should define physicalism so that it rules out radical emergentism, the thesis that life and the mind are lawfully emergent from but irreducible to physical reality. Physicalism should also be understood, according to this way of thinking, to rule out panpsychism, the thesis that mind is fundamental and exists everywhere, including at the microphysical level. This philosophical move of trying to define physical has the benefit of giving physicalism a definite content, which can be either true or false, but it comes at the cost of trying to legislate in advance what physical can mean. It amounts to philosophers saying that we shouldn't hand over all authority to the physicists to say what physical means. Now that strikes me as too high a price to pay. It flies in the face of the history of science. Let's remember that the meaning of the word physical has changed dramatically since the 17th century. Matter was once thought to be inert, impenetrable, rigid, and subject only to deterministic and local interactions. Today we know that this is wrong in virtually all respects. We accept that there are several fundamental forces, particles that have no mass, quantum indeterminacy, and non-local relations. So we should expect further dramatic changes in our concept of physical reality in the future. For these reasons, we shouldn't simply legislate what the term physical can mean as a way to get out of Hempel's dilemma. Whatever physical means should be determined by physics and not by armchair reflection. So much for physicalism. What about objectivism? This takes us back to the blind spot. Objectivism is the thesis that the methods we use to try to obtain a subject-free description of the world are sufficient for understanding and explaining everything. Since these methods are based on abstracting away from subjectivity, turning them back onto subjectivity can't help but objectify it. This is like filling in the blind spot with more of the same and not seeing that we don't see. Now, these thoughts bring me to the relation between subjective and objective perspectives. And here I want to make several interconnected points. And for philosophers out there, these kind of combine points from Thomas Nagel and from Edmund Husserl in the phenomenological tradition more generally. We can start with the point that a maximally objective perspective would be incomplete in leaving out the subjective. This is the main idea of Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? A maximally objective perspective on the bat would leave out the bat's subjectivity, how the world appears to the bat. The general point is that the world appears a certain unique way for a subject of experience, and this appearing can't be expressed in objectivist terms because the whole point of the objective framework is to remove the phenomenal. It's not to say we can't establish correlations between physical parameters and aspects of appearance, relying again in our own case on reports. It's that they can't be identified. So that's first point. Second point is that the very idea of any kind of cognitive perspective, including an objective perspective, presupposes a subject whose perspective it is. That entails that a completely objective, viewerless view is inconceivable or nonsensical. The third point concerns how to think about the subject. We shouldn't think of it as a little tag end of the world, to use Husserl's expression. In other words, we shouldn't think of the subject as a thing, either a mental thing or a physical thing, because again, that objectifies the subject. Rather, the subject is a necessary condition of the possibility of the world having sense or being intelligible. To turn a condition of sense into an objective entity is a confusion and a reification. The subject is a condition for the intelligibility of any perspective on the world, however objective that perspective may be. The fourth point is that objectivity is as irreducible and essential a feature of perspectives as subjectivity. This suggests that subjectivity and objectivity somehow depend on each other for their sense, and neither one can be reduced to the other. They're necessary correlates of each other. Now, subjective and objective are very abstract terms, but we can make them more concrete by using the terms lived experience and life world. Lived experience is first-hand experience, the immediacy of perception and action. And the life world is the everyday world, the experiential realm of our practices and our projects. Classical science is built on the dream of escaping from the life world to attain a God's eye point of view. This is very explicit in Galileo, for example, in his writings. But the scientist is always embedded in the life world. As the physicist analyzes her data, she takes for granted the feeling of the computer keys at her fingertips and her perception of the images on the screen. She's peripherally aware of the chair she's sitting on, the floor beneath her feet, and the larger setting of the lab. Extending outwards, her awareness ultimately includes the sense of being in a world, the feeling of being immersed in a here and now, belonging to and embracing space and flowing time. This tacit awareness of the world frames whatever occupies her focus of attention, and it serves as the constant backdrop for everything she does. Now, of course, these facts are in a way obvious, but the less obvious point is that the inescapability of the life world isn't a contingent limitation. It's a necessary truth. The life world is a necessary condition of possibility for science. So the classical dream of trying to step outside the life world doesn't make sense. Now, it's tempting to say that the life world isn't the real world. The real world is the world described by science. But the life world is what's actually available to perception and action, including all the ways we enlarge our perception and action with technology and scientific instruments. Scientific models, however, are derivative constructs that we arrive at through abstraction and idealization. They are mathematical entities, formal structures, images, analogies. Galileo's model of a frictionless plane, the Bohr model of the atom, evolutionary models of isolated populations, these exist in the scientist's mind, not in nature. This is why phenomenologists reverse things and say that the life world is the real world. Phenomenologists, like Husserl, argue that scientific theories aren't literally true in the sense of telling us how the world is in itself outside the range of our perception and action, including its enlargement with scientific instruments. Instead, scientific theories are empirically adequate in the sense of agreeing with actual observable data that exist in the life world. In this respect, phenomenologists agree with constructive empiricists in the philosophy of science like Bosman Frazen. There are disagreements, but on that point, I think they're agreed. From this perspective, when we do science, we set aside aspects of human experience on which we can't always agree, ones that depend on and vary with our particular body and its sense organs, our location, and so on. Using mathematics and logic, we construct abstract formal models of invariant structural aspects of what we perceive, what we can measure. We treat these as stable objects of public consensus. We intervene in the course of events by isolating and controlling things that we can perceive and manipulate. And we use our abstract models and concrete interventions to calculate future events. We then check these predicted events against our perceptions. We iterate this whole process and continually refine it. Now, at every step of this procedure, subjectivity, understood as a condition of sense or meaning, is present. It's present as the condition of the sense of any observation or measurement. It's present as a condition of the sense of equations and propositions. Theories and models depend for their sense and intelligibility on the subjectivity of scientists, or rather, the intersubjectivity of the scientific community. And the structural and dynamical invariants of the models are purified extracts, this is Michel Bitbul's term, purified extracts of our intersubjective experience of the life world. These thoughts give us another way to formulate the blind spot. The blind spot of science isn't just lived experience, it's the life world. More precisely, it's the correlational structure of the life world and lived experience, where lived experience now has to be understood in terms of intersubjectivity, not just subjectivity. Physicalistic, objectivism, or scientific materialism overlooks the primacy of the life world. The life world is the shared system of meanings and practices by which we live, including when we're doing science. Although the life world is always subject to transformation, so it's by no means a static and fixed thing, so it's not an absolute foundation, it's, in Husserl's expression, the grounding soil of the scientifically true world. The life world supplies the concrete content required for abstract scientific theories. Life world observations stand as the ultimate court of appeal when rival scientific theories compete, especially during times of scientific crisis or revolution. Science enlarges the life world and opens new vistas, but never steps outside it. Husserl's metaphor for this is the horizon, another visual metaphor. The life world is the horizon from within which everything is disclosed to us, including when we're doing science. The creativity of science consists not in stepping beyond or outside the horizon of the life world, which is impossible, but rather in constantly enlarging the horizon and opening up new vistas. Think about the horizon metaphor. On the one hand, the horizon is the farthest point the eye can see before the Earth's surface curves away beneath our view. On the other hand, the horizon is a structure of perception, not something that exists apart from perception. It's an apparent line and travels with us. So to say that the life world is the horizon is to say both that it's out there and that it's a structure of lived experience. Now, here we come upon an odd reversal. As scientists, we have to say that the universe, the whole cosmos, all of nature, contains our life world. The world of human experience is a tiny part of the much vaster universe of nature. And that's true, of course. But here's another truth. The life world contains the universe. We get this reversal once we think of the world in the philosophical sense as the space of meaning within which anything is intelligible. The universe is always disclosed to us from within the life world. The life world is the space of meaning within which anything is observable and thinkable. This isn't an empirical truth about nature. It's a philosophical truth about meaning. The world as the space of meaning takes priority in the order of inquiry for the philosopher over the universe as represented by empirical science. All right, so let me summarize things so far. I've said that science is a method for objective knowledge and thereby occludes the subjective. We can put this idea in different ways. Science occludes the lived body, it occludes the life world, it occludes direct experience, it occludes consciousness, and so on. The most abstract way to put it is that science doesn't see the ultimate experiential conditions of its own intelligibility. That is its blind spot. Okay, so now coming to the end, I want to consider a challenge to this way of thinking. And it has to do with scientific statements about nature before there was life on Earth, before there was any subjectivity. This includes, for example, the statements of cosmology. The French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux appeals to these kinds of statements to criticize what he calls correlationism. Correlationism is the idea that, this is a quotation from his book, we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. Meillassoux rejects this, correlationism, and instead defends the idea that physical reality, especially when it's understood in terms of mathematics, is absolute, by which he means that it's separate from thought and from our access to it. He calls physical reality, understood as the absolute, the great outdoors, le grand dehors. Now, he calls statements about the universe before subjectivity existed ancestral statements. He also uses the term arche-fossil, which means a thing that existed before life on Earth. Science produces statements describing ancestral states of affairs and arche-fossils. Meillassoux describes the arche-fossil as anterior to subjectivity, by which he means conceptually prior to and temporally before subjectivity. The question he asks is, what are the conditions of possibility of ancestral statements? How is it that they can be meaningful? He claims that correlationist thinking can't give a satisfactory answer to this question. So phenomenology, the correlation of the life world and lived experience, and science as a project within it, that's an example for him of correlational thinking. So he claims that that way of thinking can't give a satisfactory answer to this question of how ancestral statements can be meaningful. In other words, it can't do justice to the face value realist meaning of ancestral statements. Okay, so I'm not convinced by his argument. So there are a number of things to say here. First, phenomenologists like Husserl generally understand scientific statements about unobservables according to a kind of counterfactual analysis. So the idea is,
It's not time off. You can keep going.
I was worried that that was my time. Adam. Okay, so phenomenologists like Husserl generally understand scientific statements about unobservables according to a counterfactual analysis. So the idea is that if a member of the epistemic community were suitably located, then the object could be made present to conscious observation. Or to put it more strongly, we can make rational assertions about objects only if it is possible for those objects to become present within a correlation between the subject and the world, where it is possible allows for the counterfactual reading. If the subject were suitably located, then she could observe the object. Now, Meillassoux would likely argue that this won't work for ancestral phenomena because there were no subjects, so it wasn't possible for any subject to be there. But matters aren't so simple. We can and do already observe ancestral phenomena because of the interrelations of space and time. What's long ago and far away are intimately connected. Our super powerful telescopes let us look at things over 10 billion light years away, which is also very far back in time. And if we were located elsewhere in the universe, this is the counterfactual supposition, we could observe events that happened on Earth before the emergence of life. So the counterfactual analysis may still work, and Meillassoux' argument may miss the target partly for empirical reasons. A more general point, though, is that his argument rests on a problematic conception of science. He assumes that the statements of fundamental physics have to be understood according to a rationalist version of metaphysical realism, that the statements literally and truly describe the mathematical structure of reality as it is in itself apart from the observer. But the development of physics itself has called this kind of realism, rationalist metaphysical realism, into serious question. Other kinds of realism may be possible, but they may actually affirm something like correlationism. For example, quantum Bayesianism, here I go out on a limb because maybe I don't understand this properly, but I'm going to go out on a limb anyway. Quantum Bayesianism treats quantum theory as a tool agents use to manage their expectations and their interactions with aspects of physical reality that they can manipulate and measure. This kind of realism is said to be a participatory realism. I believe that's your term, right? But participatory seems to imply correlational, that what we have access to is reality as it acts on us and we act on it. Okay, so the last point I want to make about the ancestrality argument is that it takes time for granted. Ancestral statements are said to be statements about the past before the appearance of subjectivity. But what secures the meaning of the past for us? Cosmology doesn't explain what's meant by past, nor can it do so, nor is it its job to do so. On the contrary, it takes for granted our pre-theoretic experience of time in the life world. The point here is that the ancestrality argument can't just help itself to the notion of the cosmic past without begging the question, the philosophical question, of the conditions of the possibility of the sense or intelligibility of the concept of the past or the concept of time more generally. The phenomenologist argues that the sense and intelligibility of any concept of time derives from and presupposes our lived experience of time. And this was essentially Bergson's point in his debate with Einstein. Okay, so coming into the end now, it's very important that we distinguish here between two very different claims. One is that nothing exists outside of or apart from experience. That's not the claim I'm making. That's a first-order claim about existence. It amounts to what philosophers call subjective idealism, that everything exists inside the mind or everything that exists is dependent on the mind. But the claim I'm making isn't about existence. It's about meaning or sense or intelligibility. The claim is that how things appear to us, how they show up for us in the life world, in our perception and action, is a necessary condition of the possibility of things being intelligible at all. So in philosophical jargon, this is a transcendental claim in Kant's sense of transcendental. It's about the conditions of possibility of the intelligibility of things, such as the past or time, given that they are indeed intelligible. So there's no problem with ancestrality statements understood as statements about facts in the past before there was subjectivity. Rather, the point is that such statements have no sense or intelligibility once you remove the life world. In that case, the statements suffer from a kind of presupposition failure, and they have no significance. They're neither true nor false. They don't refer at all. Okay, so I want to conclude now by highlighting two problems that arise from the ideas that I've sketched. One problem has to do with confronting a certain kind of paradox. David Carr, philosopher who writes on transcendental philosophy, Kant and Husserl, he calls it the paradox of subjectivity. This is the title of his 1999 book on the self in the transcendental tradition. The paradox is that the subject is both a condition of world experience and a part of the experienced world. As a condition of world experience, in the sense of a condition of the intelligibility of anything that is a possible object of experience, in that sense, the subject isn't part of the world. It's not a thing in the world. But at the same time, of course, the subject is always in the world and is always experienced as being in the world. All of our experience is experience of being embodied and situated with the bodies and situations that we have. So the question is how to think about this paradox. One way to go is to try to eliminate one or the other of the two sides. And this gives us either idealism, collapsing everything into the subject, or realism or objectivism, collapsing everything to the object side. Another way to go is to see the paradox as an important truth, as telling us something fundamental about our existence. There are different ways that that idea can be articulated. Phenomenologists, at least since Merleau-Ponty, see the paradox as constitutive of the lived body. It's both subject and object in the world, condition of the world. Merleau-Ponty also describes it as constitutive of the very phenomenon of the perceived world. Other philosophers see it as a case of dialetheism. A dialetheia is a statement, a sentence that's a true contradiction. These philosophers see it as indicating the need for a paraconsistent logic, in which the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold, or you don't have the possibility of deriving any statement from a contradiction as you do in classical logic. Now, I don't have time to go into all this here, and it raises all sorts of other things that some of the speakers may talk about. I just want to flag this question about paradox as an important philosophical issue. So that's one problem. Second problem is the temptation to try to devise a new metaphysics of, let's call it pure experience, to use William James's term. This often follows on the heels of thinking about the paradox. The idea is that the paradox arises because we're thinking in terms of a subject-object dualism, but once we drop this dualism, we will find revealed to us a new ontology of pure experience beyond duality. And it's at this point that appeals to certain lines of thought in Buddhism, not all of Buddhism, but certain lines of thought, Yogacara, Dzogchen, Zen. This is one entry point for engagement with that. Okay, so speaking for myself, this approach doesn't move me, or sometimes it moves me, but then I think better of it. Or let's say I'm ambivalent. In any case, I don't doubt that there can be experiences free of subject-object structure, but I don't see good reasons to privilege them as the basis of a new metaphysics. In my view, that path veers off in a speculative direction and disconnects itself from science. So in conclusion, for me, the critique of the blind spot is a kind of epistemological critique that is carried out under the suspension of or abstention from those kinds of metaphysical considerations or speculations. The critique is meant to remind us that experience and what we know as reality are inextricable. It's meant to remind us that, in Marcelo Gleiser's words, scientific knowledge is a self-correcting narrative made from the world and our experience of it evolving together. Thank you.
Let's start with Bob, please.
That was great, thank you, Evan. There's one point, though, where it felt to me like you were becoming somewhat dogmatic in claiming that talk of a world outside the life world is sort of fundamentally unintelligible. And then you invoked the notion of a horizon. What you said is we can expand the horizon. But it seems to me question-begging because when the horizon expands, is it not expanding in reference to something that lies beyond the horizon? And if there ain't nothing beyond the horizon, then what does it mean to talk? Then the entire metaphor is not terribly useful.
Right. So this is the intentionality in the phenomenological sense of the life world, is that the life world always points beyond itself. So it already contains as part of its sense or intelligibility transcendence. But that transcendence is immanent within the life world. So it's just another version of the paradox if you want to go like straight to the heart of it, right? It's the same as subject-object intentionality. To be a subject is to intend an object, but to intend an object is to intend something transcendent of the subject. But an object is what it is only because its condition of intelligibility is the presence of the subject. It's the same point for the life world and how it opens out into what's beyond it. So I hope that's not dogmatic, but should
Michelle,
I? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Ivan. As ever, I agree with virtually everything.
99.9, and this
No, of course. So the point is that, you know, the argument you criticized by Kanta Miyasu is an argument that he elaborated in order, he says, to defend science against the aggression of philosophy, especially of continental and French philosophy. And in fact, what he defends is not science, it's the naive view of some scientists who believe that they just have direct access to reality and so on, and they don't raise any question about that. So in fact, what we try to do is to point out that in order to understand science, to make science intelligible, we have to withdraw complete adhesion to this kind of naive realism. So one way to do that, and you also pointed out to this, and I will rephrase this my way, is to say, for instance, that what we are missing, this condition of possibility of making sense of the world, namely essentially, experience and life world, cannot be called natural, and yet it is not supernatural. I would call that in agreement, I think, with the spirit of phenomenology, infranatural or subnatural, namely something that is, since it is a condition for us to speak to about nature, it's below the level of nature. It's something that is more primitive than nature, so to speak. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I
phrasing?
recognize that line of thought. I mean, I'm hesitant to do that because it gives the word nature over to the objectivist conception, and I would rather not do that. It makes naturalism equivalent to physicalism, and I think I would like there to be a space for a naturalism that isn't a physicalistic objectivism. So when you do it that way, you start to go down the path of what I was calling the metaphysics of pure experience. Like, you haven't gone all that way yet, but that's like the first step, and that's what I'm not. I need to be persuaded to go down that road. Yeah.
Just to continue this line, I was just thinking about our conversation last night about realism versus realistic, right? I mean, there's something, I think, in our discussions that the lived experience is in some sense realistic. It's what we directly encounter, and we draw from that, and we take science on as a project, and we build and we do theory building. But the problem with realism, especially the naive realism that comes sort of, especially when you're a young scientist, that this theory just is the world. That when it gets, especially with what happens with quantum mechanics, you sort of it gets strained, more and more strained in its relationship to, again, this is, we'd like to be able to come back to nature, and in some sense, what by nature we mean perhaps is what is realistic, as opposed to this sort of strained sense of realism. And I think maybe that's part of the project of the blind spot, is to define, I like that, what we talked about yesterday, that a naturalism is also to be realistic, which is to be grounded here, not in ever higher levels of abstraction, and saying those abstractions are in fact the real world.
Yeah, I mean, these terms, that philosophers love to use, like realism, idealism, I mean, they're very problematic, I think. They're like crutches for our thought, and every philosopher and author uses them in different ways, and then there are camps and debates that happen, and it's important to try to step back, I think, and rethink things without those, terms impeding us. So I think that would be one way to put it. There is a realism about the concrete in phenomenology that I think, we can all work with. It's the metaphysical isms that get generated out of that make things, much more difficult.
One more? Oh, Peter, yes.
So I didn't hear you use the word causation, but one of science's goals is to portray a complete picture of causation. Now, problems arise with that because it's problematic to have multiple descriptions of causation, both of which are true. So a concrete example: someone goes to the dentist because they have a toothache. Now, if you assume that consciousness is realized in neuronal activity, which is realized in or supervenes upon things all the way to the bottommost level, well, if the pretense of physics that there's a complete description at the bottommost level is correct, and this is Jaguar Kim's argument, then all causation seeps down to that level. Okay, so if his argument is incorrect, then the question is how it is so. How can consciousness both be realized in quarks or strings or whatever's at the bottommost level, and yet also influence that level such that things will turn out otherwise than they otherwise might have?
Yeah, I mean, there's more than causation built into what you just said, because there's a levels of reality picture with some levels being more fundamental than others, and the more fundamental levels of the smaller ones, and I mean, there's a whole metaphysics of thinking about science and the scientific worldview that I would want to step back from and question before we even got to the question about causation, which is hard enough as it is. But I mean, causation is, again, a case where I would say that causation has a lot to do with how we frame things for our explanatory ends. And so that means that, I mean, there's good ways to do it and bad ways, but we're fundamentally part of the story. It's very different from thinking that you have an outside picture on, the ultimate causal fabric of things as they are in themselves.
Okay, we got to wrap up. Thanks, Evan, very much.